Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I see that there are a number of people who have joined us from all over the world. So thank you very much for taking the time to join me this morning as we discuss Windows 7 end of life. Don't migrate, virtualize, and convert. Some of you may know me, some of you may not. My name is Simon Townsend. I've been in the end user computing industry for coming up to 20 years and have been with IGEL for about 8 months or so, but worked with them for a very, very long time. I now actually look after marketing throughout EMEA, but this morning really wanted to just go through with you what we're seeing in the market with regard to people migrating to Windows 10, what's going on in terms of cloud workspaces, and how IGEL is ultimately helping organizations save time and save money. Fairly simple topic this morning. So as I said before, if you've got any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat window and I'll try and breeze through this as quickly as I can. If you've been living under a rock, then perhaps you might have missed that Windows XP has definitely gone end of life. This is in my presentation, sadly, because I still do speak to some customers who have got machines that are connected to Windows XP devices and applications which are still running, which require XP. But as we know, XP went end of life a long, long time ago. And sadly, for some organizations, caused some fairly serious challenges in 2017 when the likes of WannaCry came out. Moving forward, though, today's webinar is obviously about Windows 7. Windows 7 is going end of life in January 2020. There are options for organizations to extend that support. So you can pay Microsoft a fee to continue supporting Windows 7, but every year that price supposedly is going to double. So it is going to become quite costly for those organizations that don't move off it by 2020. The other option you've got is to move your Windows 7 to Windows Virtual Desktops. So Microsoft have also announced with WVD that if you put Windows 7 into WVD, then they will give you an additional 3 years support if you do that. But I think for the majority of folks, they've either migrated to 10 or they're in the process of migrating to 10, and they're probably trying to do that on the endpoint to save money and to do that in the more traditional way. About 40% of enterprises are still on Windows 10. For some organizations, that operating system has been around for quite some time. It's a fairly trusted and liked operating system, to be perfectly fair. And for the most part, those organizations that went through a very costly, painful Windows XP to Windows 7 migration, they've stuck with it. Applications work. Yes, sometimes it can take a while to do some of the updates and security updates, but for the most part, it's a very familiar and manageable operating system. You know, when you look at what options you've got when it comes to migrating, particularly on the endpoint, you know, you can do in-place upgrades, you can do a wipe and reload. Lots of organizations have got System Center. Some people utilize third-party tools like Ivanti and other ones that are out there. Some organizations might actually be saying, do you know what, let's use this as an excuse to buy some new hardware. But however you're going to do it, migrating the operating system is ultimately just one challenge that you've got. For a lot of organizations, they don't actually know how many they've got. They don't know what versions they've got out there. They don't know what applications are installed. You might have corporate applications, user installed applications. You don't necessarily know the specification of the device. Has it got enough hard disk space? Has it got enough RAM, for instance? Is the BIOS, what version and type of BIOS is there installed? Does it offer secure boot? Was it partitioned? Is it part of a gold build, or was it part of a more choose your own device type of mentality? And so for lots of organizations, they're also looking at other assessment tools such as Lakeside, such as Liquidware, and many others that are out there to first of all do that level of assessment. But we all know it's not just about migrating the operating system. That desktop, as I said, is 10 years old. There's local data installed. People have personalized it. There's these things called profiles on there. You've got corporate apps, user installed apps. And a lot of organizations are actually struggling, not necessarily with the migration to Windows 10, but also what do I do about those other settings like the data, like the profile, and what do I do around testing applications that are out there in the field being used by different business units and different users before I actually make that move. The way I've seen it and the way that end user computers often looked at how a desktop is made up is they've broken it into a number of different layers. On the left hand side there, you can see a Windows 7 machine. It's ultimately made up of hardware, the operating system, applications, profiles, and data. You may have your own thoughts on whether there's more or less layers, but that's just a simple way of looking at it. And as you look at moving across to Windows 10, you need to actually consider all of those. Am I going to have to upgrade my hardware? How am I going to do my operating system upgrade? How am I going to test my apps? Am I going to use application virtualization? Am I going to SaaS or buy new applications? How am I going to deal with my profiles? Can I migrate them? Do I just delete them and start over again? And what do I do with my data? Do I back it up and then replay it back onto the new operating system? Or do I use that opportunity to move to something like OneDrive or Citrix ShareFile or whatever it might be? And so there are options and challenges at each of these levels. And really what you don't want to be doing is having to do that more than once. But obviously, we've definitely forgotten to talk about something. And in my mind, the migration to Windows 10 isn't actually the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge is the fact that we are now in a world of Windows as a service. Again, I'm sure that the majority of you on this webinar already understand what Windows as a service is. You've already felt perhaps some of the challenges, but also some of the benefits that Windows as a service brings. The fact that my Windows machine is updating on a more regular basis, more like my iPhone is doing, and providing me new features every 6 months is not a bad thing. The trouble is that obviously as new versions of Windows come out, we need to make sure that those new versions of Windows and those updates are going to continue to work. And sadly, what we've seen recently is that whilst each version of Windows is meant to update every 6 months, once in the spring and once in the fall, we've seen some slippage. So 1903, for instance, didn't actually come out until May and was arguably included a number of challenges, particularly around antivirus and certain applications not working. And it's that level of testing and QA that the enterprise needs to go through before they roll it out, that's actually causing organizations a fair amount of pain at the moment. So Windows as a service, in my opinion, is more challenging than the actual migration itself. You'll also see there that the amount of time that each version of Windows is supported changes. Again, that's been fairly fluid over the last couple of years, but where we are today is that if you take a spring release, you're going to get 18 months. Whereas if you take a full release such as 1809, you're going to get 30 months worth of support on that. You'll also notice that some of those versions of Windows 10 have now actually gone end of life, which means they've gone end of life before even Windows 7, which can blow the mind at times. The real difficulty, I think, for a lot of organizations is how we've structured IT. We've been used to spending money on Windows migration projects, gathering a team, doing this assessment, doing the planning, doing the testing, and then rolling it out, and then closing that project down. And ultimately, that does cost a fair amount of money and time to do so, but it's been fairly lumpy, as shown in the top diagram here. When you move to Windows as a service, you're actually moving to more of a business as usual type of approach. And so you're actually having to allocate time and money and people to actually deal with a more ongoing project, less lumpy. And that in itself can cause some challenges, right? I mean, people are limited, time is limited, and that Windows as a service means that you've always got to be looking at, okay, when's the next version coming? Am I going to bring that into testing? I've got to get it out into pilot. I've got to set up another deployment ring. And ultimately what you end up with is a number of different deployment rings and different versions of Windows running in your organization depending on how big it is. And if you go back to my simplistic view of what a desktop's made up from, you end up having to do this every 6 to 18 months, arguably. And whilst you could argue that once you've analyzed your data and you've backed the data up and got it into OneDrive or a central place, you don't need to worry about migrating the data and the profiles again. There's still a level of application testing, operating system testing, and change in hardware requirements that does take place. So we're in this continual loop, as we all know, and that is Windows as a service. Managing Windows on the endpoint is also costly in other ways. Only this week we've seen ransomware is still a challenge. A Nordic organization, Norwegian aluminium producer, got hit with some ransomware, took down 22,000 machines, and they had to resort back to using paper-based systems to continue their business. And you may well have seen that there's some things going on in Florida at the moment with the town and city councils, etc., where ultimately they've spent somewhere in excess of about $1 million now paying the criminals to get their data back. But managing an endpoint is time consuming. It is costly. You need AV, you need next generation AV, you need whitelisting. Machines break, things slow down. We get PC bloat, PC sprawl. You've got data on the endpoint, concerns perhaps around GDPR. How are my users going to dial in? Do they need VPN access? Is there any shadow IT going on? You guys know this better than I do. This list goes on, and quite frankly, in 2019, moving into 2020, we could probably spend a lot more of our time and money on something better than managing Windows endpoints. And so it's not, it probably is obvious to you guys that, this is one of the reasons why we are seeing a slight uptake in people looking and reconsidering VDI. VDI has probably been 12-15% of the market for many, many years. It's been dominated by one or two vendors, but the VDI, desktop as a service, or cloud workspaces, as we call it at IGEL, is set to change, and it's set to change, I think, in a rather interesting way. But people ultimately are looking at moving their Windows desktops into the data center, so that, as you can see in those screenshots there, I can access a nice corporate Windows desktop from my Mac, should I choose it. In fact, as most of you know, putting Windows in the data center or up into the cloud just means you can get secure, fast access to Windows desktops and applications with ease. Whole host of benefits of moving Windows into a virtualized environment. But if you go back to some of my previous slides, if you're looking at patching, if you're looking at the 6 months updates, if you're looking at how do I test applications, doing all of that in a data center and doing that in a virtualized environment is obviously significantly easier and has less impact on the users. As you look at the landscape now, a whole host of different vendors, and some of these are managing the actual connection and the broker of VDI, and some of them are offering actual desktop as a service solutions in the cloud, and some of them are mixing and matching it. You can put Citrix on Azure, you can put Citrix on AWS, you can put VMware on the Google Cloud Platform, etc. But there is a whole host of vendors now that are in the market who are ultimately offering easier ways to get access to Windows desktops. Amazon Web Workspaces, as an example, very, very easy. Sign up, put a credit card in, and within 20 minutes, you'll have a Windows 10 desktops spun up in the cloud that you can use, and they will bill you for on an ad hoc basis. Citrix, as another example, their cloud licensing numbers are significantly up, and a lot of organizations now looking at deploying Citrix in Azure, workloads in Azure, but utilizing the Citrix cloud platform as well. Nutanix their acquisition of Frame. Now that offers us another opportunity. But really, the worry here is that there is still an endpoint that is required to put into all of these environments. And whilst some people will say that, yep, you can use an iPhone to access a Windows desktop, we all know that that isn't necessarily the most feasible and sensible of choices. And so people look at what they're going to put on the endpoint. Is it going to be a Windows machine? Is it going to be a Mac? Is it going to be a thin client? Is it going to be something else? And ultimately, that's really where the challenge comes in. And that's really where IGEL starts to add some value. So the better way of doing this is actually to put a simple, secure operating system on the endpoints. And in our particular case, that means putting the IGEL operating system on those endpoints. They might be new, they might be old, but very simply, we are replacing the existing operating system with an IGEL OS. That IGEL OS is a Linux-based operating system. It's the only thing that IGEL do. We are focused 100% on creating this operating system. You'll see shortly it's got a whole host of different capabilities. It can connect to the majority of those cloud workspaces that are out there. It contains over 80 embedded technologies to make sure that user experience isn't affected, that existing monitoring tools and capabilities can carry on. And it has a very, very low requirement in terms of the hardware specification. So lots and lots of organizations at the moment are taking their existing thin clients, could be from a third-party vendor that have now gone out of date, taking their existing Windows 7 machines, perhaps those ones that have only got 2 or 4 gigabytes of memory and perhaps not much hard disk space left, and they are converting those endpoints into IGEL operating system endpoints. So our message is very simple. It's, why migrate on the endpoint when you can actually virtualize Windows 10 in a significantly cheaper and more simple way now, and then convert what you've got on the endpoint. And money talks, sadly. And if you're there looking at moving to Windows 10, if you're looking at upgrading your version of VDI, migrating from one vendor to another, moving from on-prem to the cloud, there will be a big budget item that says we need to invest a whole host of money on new hardware on the endpoint. And ultimately, whether it's from a capital expenditure point of view or an OPEX point of view, converting those existing endpoints into an IGEL OS is a very, very cost-effective way of extending the life of those PCs, reducing the amount of management you need to do on the endpoint, and ultimately saving a considerable amount of budget that can ultimately be spent elsewhere. These IGEL operating systems are managed by something called the UMS. You'll see the UMS in a second. That universal management suite gives us the ability to manage thousands, if not tens of thousands of endpoints, meaning that we can actually save on full-time employees, we can save on the operational costs associated with endpoint management. Typically, most organizations will look at one person can manage 250 to 500 people within an organization. Some of you may have better numbers than that. But arguably, when using an IGEL system, you really do start to scale up how many people can start to manage tens of thousands of devices, because it's really just point and click. So let's just take a very quick look at that IGEL OS. The first thing I'm going to do is look at how we do a conversion. One of the ways in which you can do it, and I suppose it's used to explain the simplicity, is to take hold of something we call the IGEL UD Pocket. Small USB device, put it into any device, again, whether that be a thin client or an x86 device, put it in, dual boot, and either boot off that USB key and run the operating system directly, or convert that machine entirely, get rid of everything else that was underneath it, and convert it into an IGEL OS. So when you remove that key and you boot it up, it will carry on. There's a whole host of ways in which you can get the operating system down to an endpoint. The USB key is just a simple way of demonstrating it. But if you wanted to use, a third-party management tool, if you wanted to plug it into an SCCM, an Avanti endpoint manager, or whatever it might be, there are obviously ways of doing it. So very simply, what we've got here is a Windows machine. It's running on a Lenovo 430. There's actually a fair amount of RAM in this particular machine. What I'm going to do is plug, you'll see on the right hand side of the screen there, we've got a white USB key in, we've dual booted, and we're going to choose to select to boot from the IGEL UD Pocket. Very quickly it says, do you want to do a standard installation? And we then go through and ensure that the BIOS settings are correct, the partitions are correct. We wipe everything that was on that disk previously, and then we go through and convert that into an IGEL OS. When it's finished, we get told to remove the USB stick, we reboot, and this time instead of booting into Windows 7, we actually boot into the IGEL OS. In this particular case, we're booting into something called the IGEL workspace, and I now have got a IGEL operating system in front of me in pretty much its default state. That whole process typically takes anywhere between 9 and 15 minutes to do that conversion. So a very, very simple way of taking what was arguably an operating system that was going end of life on a piece of hardware that may, from a RAM point of view, run Windows 10, but we've converted that into a IGEL operating system. If I come out of that and I actually take you into my virtual environment here, you'll actually see I've got two virtual machines running. One of them is running the IGEL OS. The other one is running Windows Server 2016. It's got the management on it as well. That management server can be run on-prem. It can be run in the cloud. There are secure gateways that you can deploy, so you can have HTTP access from all of your IGEL operating systems over the cloud into your environment. But here is a typical IGEL operating system running as a VM. If you want to go to igel.com/download, you can download the operating system there as well. You can spin up VirtualBox or Fusion or whatever VMs you've got, create a 64-bit Ubuntu device, and obviously mount the ISO that you've downloaded, and away you go. Very simply, you open it up. It typically comes very locked down, the operating system. In this particular case, I have deployed Google Chrome onto this environment. So if I just open up Google Chrome there, that will go and connect to the internet, connect to our website, advertise the fact that you can win a Porsche Taycan this year. That's a campaign that's going until the end of the year. If you want to go and take part in that campaign, I'll give you a code so you can do that at the end of this webinar. But ultimately, I've now got a secure read-only operating system on my environment. Supports Wi-Fi, supports dual NICs. This could have been installed on one of the IGEL thin clients. It could have been installed on an Intel NUC. It really doesn't matter what it's been installed on. What we want to do, though, obviously, is empower people to get access to those Windows cloud-based workspaces. So, typical. I need to put my password in there. What you'll see here is the IGEL Universal Management Suite. And what I do is I create profiles. And those profiles contain settings and connections for me and my estate and my users. So there's one here for Citrix. There is one here for VMware. There is one here for the web browser. There is one here for Chrome. There is one here for a connection to AWS. I can set a profile up to automatically launch the Citrix client when I boot up the machine, or I can lock that machine down so they can't make any changes to the Wi-Fi settings or the network settings. And then I come in and I create logical groups of machines. My particular machine at the moment has just got a generic number. You can see it's green there. It's called ITC08. You can see that it's all been licensed, and it's got an IP address, so that's good. Very simply, all I'm going to do is I'm going to move that machine into the group called London. It's going to ask me whether I want to do that and whether I want to do it at the next reboot or do it now. Because we're in a demo, I'm going to do it now. And when I go to my machine, you'll see that this machine says it's got a new configuration. Do I want to apply it? I'm going to say yes. I'm going to apply that new profile to that machine. It's going to download the wallpaper. It's going to add Citrix in. I've now got a fairly nice picture of London and the Thames there, and I've now got access to Citrix. Again, when I double click on that, that's now going to go off, connect to Storefront. It's going to pull my applications down. I might have set it to auto log in and just present me with a full-blown desktop. In this particular case, it's not configured like that. It's allowing me to go on to double click, go and get those applications, and ultimately they will come down and deliver me all of my applications. There's my applications. If I want to log on and run one of those applications, I'll now connect back into the Citrix cloud environment that I believe runs in Germany, and that will now allow me nice, secure access to an application running on a Citrix data center. Off we go, and we're logged in. So what then happens if I decide that I now need to deploy another application, or a business unit comes to me and says, hey, I'm going to deploy an application via AWS, or we're using VMware, or whatever that might be. Very simple. I take this machine and I move it to my next logical group. In this particular case, I have got a group called Holiday Working. And Holiday Working has got a nice wallpaper, which has got a picture of a beach on it, and it gives me access not just to Citrix, it gives me access to a Firefox browser, RDP, VMware, AWS. All can be either configured or not configured, and again, I send that down, and very simply, I now get a new wallpaper, and I now get access to a whole host of different connections. If I choose to log off my Citrix session, that will make that a little bit cleaner to look at. You can now see here I've got the Firefox browser. I can connect to Horizon, and in fact, if I wanted to connect to the Amazon workspaces, I could come into here, if I remember my passwords correctly, and I can now via the Teradici PC over IP client, which is fairly powerful. That will allow me to connect into my workspaces environment. And with any luck, there we have it, a Windows desktop running on an IGEL operating system being delivered from the Amazon cloud. And again, nice and responsive. Say hello. So very simple. If I need to update the firmware on that device, it's all done from the management center. If I need to take remote control of it, it's all done from the management center. But you can see here, not a lot needs to happen. And this is where a lot of organizations are literally manning tens of thousands of endpoints through a very, very comprehensive and powerful, simple drag and drop interface. There are APIs available for that management infrastructure as well. So some customers have linked that in to things like ServiceNow or BMC or the Avanti old Heat product to try and automate a lot of that as well. I mentioned before the ecosystem. This is where we work with alliance partners, and we're putting their technology inside our operating system. So out of the box, when you deploy that simple, secure OS, you're going to get technology built in like Device Trust that does contextual security control into your desktop virtualization. You're going to get Improvata if you're using smart card readers and fingerprint readers. You're going to be able to solve printing challenges with ease within that virtual desktop environment and use some of the newer cloud-based printing services like those from Printalogic as an example. If you're using Lakeside, Liquidware, Login VSI, ControlUp to monitor your environment, everything you do on an IGEL endpoint can also be fed back in because their agents are included. And if you're doing anything around unified communications with Avaya, Skype, Teams, not yet, but moving forward, we can start to offload a lot of that. Just making sure that things like Jabra headsets, Plantronics headsets, they all work in that operating system. Linux actually is, I don't have the power, I don't have the slide in front of me right now, but interestingly enough, IDC report that has come out this week, which is available on our website, now demonstrates that Linux on the endpoint, it has now overtaken Windows on the endpoint when connecting into these types of cloud workspace environments. So just proves that that technology, the support for those technologies have really come on. So there we go. I've probably been speaking far too long, but why not migrate? Why not virtualize Windows 10 in the data center and then put IGEL on the endpoint? Updates are easier, definitely easier to test and deploy from the data center to the cloud. You can deploy these new versions of Windows far quicker. There's a whole host of technologies in VDI that allow you, whether it's machine creation services or PVS or imaging, there's a whole host of technologies out there that make spinning up thousands, tens of thousands of machines on a new version of Windows 10 significantly easier than rolling it out onto the endpoint. Patching, security, keep the InfoSec people happy. You know what you've got installed. You're not having to go through a continual assessment of what applications and what data is out there every time you want to do a new deployment. And IGEL on the endpoint, as I said, it's read-only. It's nice and secure. There's no need to replace that hardware. You can save a load of money. I can't tell you the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds that are being saved by some of our customers at the moment. Manage thousands of machines as one, and therefore save a load of time and money. That's really summarized there. If you want more information, you go to igel.com. igel.com/download can get you information. There's a contact form on that website. Someone will pick the phone up and get in contact with you quickly. If you go to igel.com/Windows 10, there are more webinars and more. That's a microsite dedicated to whether you've migrated or not. If you want to get in contact with me or follow me on Twitter, please do, Simon_Townsend. I'm always happy to help. And if you like a chance to win the Porsche Taycan this year, draw being done at the end of the year, go to ichallengeeverything.com, enter the code Windows 7. If you're an existing IGEL customer, which I know some of you are, then you can also fill out an additional form, just helping us with a survey in terms of what you're using, and you'll also be put into a separate draw to win some other pieces towards the end of the year. Well, thank you very much for joining. This webinar will be recorded. We'll send it out to you afterwards. And if you, as I say, if you do want to get in touch, please feel free to reach out to us. We are a friendly bunch of individuals and we are happy to talk. Thanks very much for your time.